when do you plant, for example? What varieties do you use? A drought-resistant variety, another variety. Most farmers don't have access to state-of-the-art weather forecasts around, around the world. I'm not talking about one country. In low and middle-income countries, they don't have access to that. Now, there's a huge advance. We tend to think of large language models, but obviously AI is pushing science forward, and that includes in weather forecasting. There's really a revolution driven by AI. But weather forecasts are non-rival, they're largely non-excludable. They're the classic definition of a public good. So there's a strong rationale for national governments, in some cases supported by multilateral development banks, to make investments in producing and disseminating AI weather forecasts. Again here, India is a leader. So if you, India in particular, the Indian government distributed forecasts AI weather forecasts to 38 million farmers last year. And the evidence suggests that farmers, both from India, from this particular case, that in area, I'll say a little bit about last year's monsoon. It came early in Kerala in southern India, but then there was an unexpected delay in the progression. The AI forecasts got that right. That was the only source of information that reached farmers with that. In the areas, we did a survey above that line, and farmers are responding, and they transplant more, they use hybrid seeds more. Evidence from around the world is consistent with this. Farmers respond to these AI weather forecasts. So I think that's one example, but many others, and happy to discuss them in education and traffic enforcement and elsewhere.
Michael, your answer should be read the book.
Okay.
We've spoken about the use cases of India, but setting up digital IDs, of course, is a sovereign decision. It's something India could do unilaterally. When it comes to the large language models, that's not reality. The large language models are concentrated in the US, in China now with DeepSeek. Anu, in a world where you largely have the rules being set by the two large powers, the US and China, arguably there's of course the EU as well, and you've done a lot of work on that. Who sets the AI rules for the global south? Is there even the possibility for the global south to talk about sovereignty?
So I think the global south has the same kind of incentive for their own AI sovereignty, including then regulatory sovereignty, to design the rules that better work for their economies, for their societies, for what the public interest in these jurisdictions calls for. But regulating AI is a really difficult, even for very established bureaucracies. You need to be able to then make sure that it is an innovation-friendly, and yet you at the same time need to be carefully managing the risks for individuals and societies. So even very established regulators like the European Union found it one of the most challenging tasks to come up with the AI Act. So there's probably something to be learned from these jurisdictions that have gone ahead and done the kind of thinking that had then resulted into some of those regulatory frameworks that we have now in place. So if you think about the choices that India has when it looks around, one of them is to think about, okay, how does the EU go about this? The EU follows what I would call a rights-driven approach to regulation. So what is really characterizing this, the first horizontal binding, so economy-wide regulation that the Europeans enacted, it is a regulation that seeks to protect the fundamental rights of individuals, the democratic structures of the society, and that also seeks to ensure a greater distribution of the benefits from AI revolution. So the European approach is very conscious that it wants to also share some of the benefits, so they don't all go to the large developers of these models, but individual users, society at large, smaller companies benefit from AI as well. So there's something I think the Europeans can teach in terms of that regulatory approach, in addition to maybe then some details of how that regulation in the end was constructed. But just one word, India is a formidable economy that doesn't need to take a template and plug it into the economy as such. I think India is in a very good position to take the lessons that serves its needs, yet make the kind of local modification and variations that are more reflecting the distinct priorities of this country.
Anu, before I turn to Iqbal, a quick follow-up question to you. As India makes its own rules, where does the trade-off lie between regulation and innovation?
So this is very interesting because often I am based in the US, but I'm initially from Europe, and these two jurisdictions are described as the US develops technologies and the Europeans regulate those technologies. So in many ways, does India want the innovation path or the regulation path? And I think there are many votes who would go for innovation. But I really would like to debunk this myth that to me it's a false choice to say that the reason we don't see these large language models being developed in Europe is not because there's the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. It's not because there is AI Act. So the reason there is a perceived innovation gap between the United States and Europe is, I think, four things. So first, there is no digital single market in Europe. It's very hard for these AI companies to scale across 27 distinct markets. Second, there's no deep, robust capital markets union. 5% of the global venture capital is in Europe, over 50% in the United States. That explains why the US has been able to take much greater steps in developing AI technologies. Third, there are legal frameworks and cultural attitudes to risk-taking. Europeans have some of the most punitive bankruptcy laws in the world. I wouldn't encourage you to replicate that because it's very hard to innovate on the frontier of technological innovation because sometimes you fail, but you need to be then given the second chance. And the fourth, I think, the sort of foundational pillar of the robust US tech ecosystem is that the US has been spectacularly successful in harnessing the global talent that have chosen to come to the US, including many Indian data scientists, engineers who think that US is the place where they can start their companies, scale their companies, fund their companies, US universities can attract them. So the idea that choosing to follow or imitate aspects of the European rights protective regulation would come at the cost of innovation, we need to understand better what drives the technological innovation and whether regulation should be falsely accused as the impediment to innovation. And I don't think that's the case.
Because we've got to protect models from being jailbroke. We've got to make sure that the models don't leak our confidential information or poison our data. We've got to make sure that most of these are open source models, that they come with inherent vulnerabilities, so how do we detect them? So we've got to think about securing AI.
What should policymakers keep in mind when deciding?
Absolutely, and very rightly said. So it's becoming fundamental part of the infrastructure that is being then used to build applications. So earlier, I think the perspective which changed was that we were looking at AI just at the application layer, but it's gone much below in the infrastructure. It's got embedded into the kind of systems which are now getting created and deployed for citizen scale. So, and that is where I'd like to bring in Nalin sir, your perspectives on what are you seeing in terms of national security? You know, is it something which is giving us a spike, a blip, something which you can disclose here?
Data and rigorous evidence.
Yeah, I mean, it's required to be discussed. That's one thing.
The application of all of that. To
no,
the
one.
AI,
I take the points that you've said.
I think the first thing.
One thing about all the other technological revolutions which cited is that there was a time frame over which that seeped into the system.
I'm so heartened that the
and then we had time to look at how do I use it, and also to look at the adversarial effects of it and how do I mitigate those things. Case of AI is that it's really happening at a breakneck speed, and there's also an adoption, willingness to adopt into enterprises of the different AI tools. So that is where the scary part is there. And the other is the adversarial part of the AI is that though we are you use AI for cybersecurity, but the issue is that there are nation states or big enterprises which are adversarial enterprises which will be using AI as a tool for doing it, and they have got a lot of motivation to put in effort and thought process into how do I use it more effectively.
And we have
Then the persons who are actually using AI for their own benefit, in terms of they're looking at, how do I improve my productivity, how do I improve my efficiency, that's the focus.
Are different.
So this is where there's a disconnect, and this has to be really bridged, and that's where the problem is. This summit actually, in one way, it's helping people become conscious about some of the measures that are taken.
This AI, I did a randomized evaluation, and I found
the other is the difference between other systems and this is,
great,
and a little technical in the sense that, in the other systems we have a separate control plane and a separate data plane.
That is not what.
And there we could actually control, provide access the limits to the control plane. But here the data itself is the control. So you have that poisoning of models happening through the inputs that are there. So you could have a drift, and over a period of time, you'll find that the model not be behaving as you would expect it to be. And it's not also very deterministic. So there are challenges in, how do I protect it now? There's AI systems to see that it gives me the consistent results
at the same
over a period
time,
of
you're also
time.
thinking about,
Then there is also lack of clarity about,
or is this a problem?
what is a cybersecurity issue there?
And
what is the issue of malfunctioning or a poor design of an AI system? That lack of clarity also results in
I think there are lots of
the
examples
challenges
from India,
that
so
are
I'm going to
there.
focus on
I think these are the preliminary thoughts that I have. So at the national scale, the issue is that when you have multiple entities at the enterprise scale and financial sector, the telecom sector, and all of them, and the power sector adopting AI, the effect on compromises on the critical information infrastructure is something that would actually make us wake up and then see that what could be.
So
those are issues that
excellent pointers, sir. Excellent pointers. And I think since you brought in the private sector, and the way they've evolved, and they're also subjected to these risks,
what that did
which are
is
evolving
in one of the poorest
I'd like to bring in Lakshmi sir from Tata here. So, sir, a lot of infrastructure is
vulnerable
being
public schools,
connected, communicated,
becoming
using
second best performing
what you're
state in just a matter of 2 or 3 years.
How are you seeing the
right? But
paradigm
then you
shift
start
from,
saying,
let's say, how it used to be before AI was commoditized
the
and
first thing that
everyday
they
technology?
find out is
it used to be in the
that,
labs.
a
Now
lot of
it's
people are
out
like,
and
does
in
this mean that I
everybody's
don't
hands. So what
need
is the
teachers
change
anymore? No.
that you are
You
seeing
still need the
and the
teachers.
impact
What
you
it
are seeing on critical
replaces is the
infrastructure?
rote task of the teacher having to correct spelling mistakes.
I don't think
calling you to the room and saying, hey, you forgot your comma, you forgot to
fact
capitalize. Instead, AI takes care of all of that, and now the teacher can sit with you in the free time and say, how did you set up the structure of this essay? Did you think about this analytically or not? And that's the first insight that comes from evaluation. It frees up the teacher time. Everything that we do in the field ends up adding to teachers' time, adding to the nurses' time, adding to the Anganwadi workers' time. Very few things free up time. So if your AI application can free up the time of the health frontline workers, first of all, that's a winner. The second thing that is really important here was that this is a demand-driven thing, right? Like there was a demand by the kids to improve their essays, there was a demand by the teachers to free up their time, but most importantly, there was a demand by the school districts to show progress. So I think Letters is kind of a great example of how everything comes together if you think about it ahead of time.
On top of this fragility, you add
notoriously difficult
AI.
Civil services exams. So take Iqbal more seriously than you would as just a normal.
100 times over.
Thank you. I thought that was history now.
It's never history in India.
AI
Michael, turning to you, almost as equal in accomplishment by winning a Nobel.
Especially the East-West traffic.
What risks should multilaterals like the World Bank keep in mind? Or let me rephrase that actually. Is there a risk
and
that
we all are saying,
multilaterals
I'll embed
are moving
AI
too slowly
at the edge
relative
of the
to
device,
technology?
and if I have a banking application, I will do that. But nobody has thought through. If I put an inference,
I think there's certainly, is.
The number of API calls these have to do is tremendous. And these API calls are long-lived sessions. They're not traditional API calls. So the edge infrastructure is going to come under tremendous strain. So that's why I'm saying that in all our excitement of AI, I'm very passionate and excited about AI. But I genuinely feel that people are not looking at the foundations properly. So that is very fragile, and that is one point I want to make. The second point about this is I would like to expand the scope of this discussion. It's not about AI and cybersecurity.
So I'll give you one example.
It's also about
I'm involved
a broader
in.
trust
Development
question.
Innovation Ventures that was initially set up
with,
in the U.S. government, but it's now been relaunched independently.
Messages.
It has tiered funding. So there's
apply that in the enterprise context and
pilot
those
new
I
ideas.
talk about model drifts and so on.
Then there's
and so forth.
somewhat larger.
So what we at Tadacom are doing, one is to protect the digital infrastructure through many things that we can do. And the unfortunate part is I don't think enterprises have woken up to the fact that they have to do it.
Why is that
so I tell them that you can't build a skyscraper with a foundation for bungalow, which is what they're trying to do. But when it comes to the drift and the trust part of it,
there's probably going to be insufficient
I do believe
competition.
Enterprises require an AI operating system.
But then if they have to sell them to the government, they're facing a monopoly.
What we mean by that AI operating system is something that brings the context together. Because
so
LLMs will provide the knowledge.
To
make that knowledge into
that
actionable intelligence.
Well,
you need the context layer, you need the agentic layer, and more importantly, you need to have a trust and governance layer which will control what an agent will do or will not do. And if I take that control in my hands and say that I will configure and ensure this agent will do something or not do something, I can make use of the models underneath a lot more intelligently. So I think rather than focusing on whether this LLM is good or that LLM is good and so on, this AI operating system is what is required for people to build an application which will ensure that all of these are governed.
There are a lot of deaths from traffic.
So that's a great point. In fact, I was having a conversation a few days back, and I was saying that from the time of corporate social responsibility, it's time to evolve to corporate AI responsibility, where corporates start talking about how they're controlling and owning the actions of the AI that they're building and deploying. Great perspective, sir. Thank you very much. At this point, I'd like to bring in Richard to sort of continue the talk about
Microsoft Research India
digital infrastructure and resilience. So how has resilience in your perspective evolved when we talk about AI risks to cybersecurity and vice versa?
When this was introduced, it's been introduced, I believe, in 56
the question
sites
of resilience is
hundreds
a
of
complex
thousands
question.
of people
So I will bring a few aspects that I think
took a leaf from
are very
Iqbal's
important.
book.
So
we followed up the we got information from
well understood that people are typically the weakest link in cybersecurity.
That went down
the reason is that we as human beings, we were not evolved to deal with machines, computers, and so on, and most of us don't have really deep technical knowledge about how systems work and so on. So we are, to a big extent, dependent on a relatively superficial understanding, and
probably this is one place in India where time is really
more
respected.
Easy to be
and we have to end
by
in time.
different social
So I
engineering
had
tricks
a
and
list of
so
wonderful
on.
questions.
Now
But if I could now move
AI,
to a space where we are
this is becoming a big issue because
and quick answers
how you can distinguish
deeply interesting
scam from a real communication when the scam communication looks exactly like the real communication.
We've seen many promising
I'm
technologies
talking about deep fakes and so on. So this is one aspect of the risk connected directly with people. The other aspect is that we want AI to empower people to do things, more things, and make them in an easier way. So we have those agents, and we give them some, or we want to give them some commands like do this for me or that for me, but we don't understand all the steps that the agent will take on our behalf when performing those tasks. And each of those tasks can be there can be a risk factors involved without us knowing. Like, okay, if you want to perform this action, you will need to have those additional tools to achieve that. And where you get those additional tools, okay, if AI decides on your behalf, these are the tools you need, software packages, whatever it is, and they get to your computer without this being supervised. then
publicity
this is a problem.
about
So
where
I'm heading, like resilience here is really protecting or paying attention to details. What is actually happening? What is running in the background? How are your commands transferred to the agents? Is there a possibility for them to be intercepted, to be modified? So it's even. It was difficult and complex.
I think hype is natural because the technology is exciting. It's a general-purpose technology. It's evolving so quickly. The marginal cost
even more important to really go into all the details. And we just heard from Lakshmi that he sees that we are moving towards a cliff.
So I can understand the hype.
Well, depends on us, of course. We want to go fast. We want to employ. We are all excited about AI, but we maybe sometimes we need to slow down a little bit and make sure that the pieces in the place and cybersecurity is not overlooked.
Sitting at the top is like to say not worry about
excellent perspectives, and I think
evaluation, but say
an offshoot to that question can be to Ms. Daisy, which is what are you seeing as changing, when you talk about digital infra and especially the connectivity.
Trust in technology. There are studies that found that even if you give
because you're a
frontline healthcare workers,
and here is something which is connecting a lot of things to a lot of other things. So how are you seeing changes happening, especially when you talk about resilience and
oftentimes
what's going inside digital infra?
Results.
So
and
I think,
when you try and unpack that, even though this technology worked even
the
better than the
fragility of
human
the
intervention in the lab, right? So some of these diagnostic things can work, have better predictability in the lab, but in the field, they end up decreasing. Not only is their efficiency lower, but even
we are as ready as everybody else.
Because
the bad news is maybe we're not that as ready as we think we are, which is the point Lakshmi is making, right? 90% of just under 1,000 large enterprises that we spoke to in India want to deploy
helping people understand that is very important.
40%
and the second thing is the
agent to work alongside a human being.
We just assume
but
that
only about
technology works,
2/3 of those enterprises really have a data layer, data strategy, a data platform, and a data governance
this example quickly comes
strategy.
From India, where
only about 1/4 have the compute capacity they need. Only about 1/3 are able to understand AI threats and deal with them. And less than 1/5 have the innovation engine
the machine
think about
learning
building
algorithm
and
is able to
scaling and maintaining AI
probability of predicting a bogus from 38%
clearly there
to
is this
55%
ambition versus reality gap which we have to solve for. That's not a problem as long as we all know that that's where it is, and they were acutely aware of this issue. The other thing is AI is essentially leading to what this means is that we are rewiring and restacking the enterprise. It's not just networks, it's compute,
and if you haven't
it's silicon.
I know, what is the point of
at the national level, silicon security is a conversation. So all this resiliency which we used to build almost like a bolt-on at the top, and particularly we used to think of it only as cyber resiliency. It's a system resilience which is built into all layers of the infrastructure stack, all layers of the AI stack.
So,
that's why at Cisco, since you asked me a network-specific question, we used to have, we used to deal with connectivity largely as connectivity. And now we know the persona of that end port that connects to an end device that might be doing an inferencing or it's in a data center. That persona has to be that it will be on one side, it will be a switch or a router. But on the other side, it will also be a security defense point. So this ability of building special grade of security appliances and putting them in various parts of the network is fast becoming an outdated idea.
Are allocated across firms.
Point we've got to do is we've got to break it into a number of virtual instances that can go wherever you want the security policy to be. So it becomes a very virtual distributed mesh rather than hardware. Yes, there will be hardware. I'm not saying it will go away. But this ability to infuse it into the fabric, and networks tend to be the all-pervasive fabrics, that's the way, at least as Cisco, we are thinking about it. So this domains
the final piece of evidence,
networking
and we are going to release
are
this study next week. We looked at the universities, how AI is
networking is like the conversation
universities,
the network
and we look at the AI publishing scientists.
The other part about this is
an AI
the performance
publishing scientist in academia, the top 1%, used to make around $300,000 in 2000. It went up
in a way, it's an exponential technology.
Over
the demands
2
it will
decades.
create on its underlying layers
in
is
industry
also
used to make around $550,000. Now it went up to $2 million. And there has been 2 breakpoints. One of them was in 2012. The other one was in 2017.
Has to be built, and we have to build it in new ways. We cannot build it in the ways of how we built it in the past.
Revolution in 2017.
Applications is an interesting one, right? We used to give an input,
back to the foundational model
the same
side
output
of
on the other side.
Is that
but now, if you are going to deploy AI models, this thing is probabilistic.
Industry. And after 2017, especially,
so you
when the
want to get it to a degree of assessment so that you cannot
target or
expect
the
in a financial application or a very important citizen service application, you give an input and the output
where things are going in terms
has to be deterministic, but you're using at the core of it a probabilistic technology.
When people are moving
so that
to
refinement
industry
is
from academia, their publication record goes down by 50%.
It's rethinking in ways
they start
in all layers
by
of
600%
from silicon
more after they
to
move,
software to systems.
From open
you have to rethink
to
everything. Every rule we have
science.
to rethink.
Now, spillover is extremely important for
and since you brought in that perspective of rethinking, reimagining,
so and
how we're using AI in the operating system of the company, I'd like to bring in Darshan here. So Darshan, you do a great work. You do a lot of great work in creating thought leadership content as well as doing consulting work
universities in a
for very large
healthy
companies.
way.
Of course, there's CXOs
and
very
discussion
highly
on this,
ranked official of the government sitting here. But then,
what
are the other CISOs,
CXOs
thinking about when it comes to AI? Is it still a compliance thing?
Well? So that's why I think we have to have this frank conversation early on in the game.
First of all, thank you. I probably had some context to whatever I heard so far.
Boils down to something Iqbal mentioned.
First of all,
power.
my view.
Because power still makes decisions in this world today. So, Anu, before I move to the final section of this panel,
and I'm sure
if I could ask you, if the finance minister of a developing country, let's say India, comes
AI
to you
and cybersecurity,
and asks you, Anu, how should I think? What would you tell her?
Truth.
So today, if you think about how much political power, but also geopolitical power is shaping our conversations around AI, it is something where I think each country is now pushed towards greater techno-nationalism, techno-protectionism. AI sovereignty has become almost a sort of uniformly goal for everyone. But I would remind even when encountering players like the United States and China that nobody in today's world will be completely sovereign when it comes to AI space. If I just take one layer of the AI stack as an example, what is now driving a lot of the global AI race is this idea that we want to do frontier AI, we want to have these powerful foundation models. That means you need to have a lot of compute. You can't have a lot of compute unless you have access to the highest-end semiconductors. The US is well positioned there. It is hosting the companies like NVIDIA. The US leads in the design of semiconductors, but who is manufacturing them? We really need to think about the role of Taiwan there. But then the Europeans have ASML in the Netherlands that leads in the high-end manufacturing with the equipment needed for manufacturing. But that is dependent on chemicals, where Japan is leading. And the entire supply chain relies on raw materials from China. So ultimately, all these choke points can in principle be weaponized, but that is not ultimately a sustainable strategy. Even President Trump had to walk back some of the export controls to China because Chinese were saying, okay, then the raw materials are not coming your way. So there are the potential ways to weaponize these interdependencies that ultimately make us all poorer. So as a finance minister of India, when approaching other middle powers, the great powers, I think it's good to remind ourselves that ultimately, for this technology to benefit all of us, we need to find a way, even in this today's protectionist environment, to get along and find some ways to collaborate and think about what our collective AI future looks like. And to remind the reminders of the limits of that sovereignty may be one way to begin that conversation.
Is also coming in because these are real problems.
Easily said
For example, deep fakes or
our final section is
with AI.
Of course, the rapid fire round. We all love this in this room. In one sentence, if I could ask
yes,
all
those
of
are
you,
things that you need to address, no doubt.
Johannes, you're not getting away easily. You're going to answer this as well. So in one sentence, if I could ask you, we're sitting in New Delhi 2035. Could you predict one development outcome that will have dramatically improved with the use of AI, and one risk we regret not addressing now?
Excellent views, and thank you very much for those perspectives. I'm glad that I still see people coming in. This is an interesting session.
The concentration,
and some people standing as well.
The future of market
I would like to bring in Pradeep now.
Is something that we should be
as a
concerned about, and we might regret
what
not
I just asked
having
Darshan.
discussed this
Here is something which is
in 10 years.
at the top, and you're saying while it is pertaining to
what will
strategy,
change in a positive direction, clearly healthcare
do you
and education.
think that we should have a dedicated function within an organization? And what do you see?
So first of all, it's so inspiring to hear all the use case examples, whether we talk about traffic or agriculture or education, because I often talk about the risks and the downsides.
I don't mind the
so
hope
it's a really
and the
good
fear
reminder.
because
I'm
being in
personally very
cybersecurity
excited,
space,
especially what happens
both of
in
them
the
do
education
add
space, but
more to
also
what we can
in
do,
the health
right?
space.
For
In
the
terms
industry
of
as a
the
whole,
risks,
for the country as a whole, if you
I
would.
think one thing that we are
when we look
not
at
paying attention
strategically,
to,
when
and
we
what
talk
I
to
would
the
even
leaders
call
in
a
both
systemic risk, is the idea that
companies in
many
India,
worry about
across the
AI
world,
getting almost too smart.
Predominantly when the
I'm
conversation
more
is
worried
about
about
AI,
us getting
the topic
dumber
goes
as a
towards
humanity.
innovation,
There is a temptation to start
competitiveness,
skipping
and ability to
steps,
bring in, let's say, productivity
outsourcing
gains,
your
right?
thinking and
What
your creativity
often gets missed
to these
is
models.
that
And as
AI
an
is
educator,
quietly
when I think
reshaping the
about
risk
how I
equation
will
within the
teach my
enterprise,
students to
right?
use generative
Now,
AI to enhance but
cybersecurity,
not substitute their
So
capabilities,
can
we
no
will
longer
just
be
make
just
a
about protecting
tremendous
systems and
mistake
the
if
data.
we just
Now, don't get me
forewent
wrong,
that
right?
hard
Cybersecurity
work,
is still needed
the beautiful
to be able
learning
to
of
identify all the
thinking
systems within the
hard
enterprise,
problems and
beyond
creating and
the
investing in
extended
our own
enterprise,
capabilities.
as well as be able to
And
protect
all
the data that
just
is
cannot
on
be
all of
so
these systems.
outsourced, because
But
otherwise we don't
it
even
is-
know
it
what
needs to
kind of
evolve into
questions
something
we should
more,
be
given
asking
the AI
AI
landscape,
going
which is, I loved how Lakshmi put it, right? It's going to be about trust. So going forward, can cybersecurity, how can it evolve to start protecting decision making and trust? Because trust is starting to become measurable, right, through provenance, through authenticity, as well as verification. Now, all of these mechanisms are going to come in a way that we are able to identify, measure, rate, risk rank, and call out whether this particular transaction that you're doing, whether it's a payment approval or let's say an executive communication, is trustworthy or not. And then accordingly, the agent of the system that's allowing the transaction to go through allows it or not, right? So that's something that we're seeing, and AI in this context is a force multiplier, right, on both sides. For us as defenders, we are seeing, like Darshan said, how we are able to detect, identify threats at scale and speed that we've never seen before, right? And definitely, right, bringing in again, it's not going to, so if we ask, okay, is it going to completely revamp how we do and run SOCs? A little, yes. It's not going to replace all the analysts, but definitely in terms of certain tasks that we are doing, we've already started seeing Microsoft with its security copilot, how it can automate tasks, right? Like different agents doing different tasks of the SOC lifecycle. So we're already starting to see that. Now, but in addition to that, it's also helping attackers on the other side of the equation, which is, it is industrializing disruption at scale. Think phishing, think social engineering. Now, all of these manipulations, now it's happening at an unprecedented scale. That's going to continue, and we're going to see it continue for, let's say, the next few years, because that's where we're headed. In terms of AI-related phishing, I would say definitely manipulation, and how this is going to impact the industry as a whole. Now, I would say that's pretty much how all of these, the tectonic shift is happening, right, across. So as I would say, working with leaders and board members, we are looking at how to look at these risks and how to frame these risks. And here, usually we see three lenses. So one is the compliance risk, which is, am I complying with the EU AI Act, right? Am I complying with the DPDP or other sectoral guidance? So it's more of a check-in-the-box approach, maybe helps with me in protecting against regulatory exposure, but not with systemic risk, like what Stacey was saying. The second angle, which some companies have started to move towards, is the operational risk, right? Wherein the boards are starting to ask, the models am I using, is it reliable, is it safe, is it trustworthy? And what is the risk if this particular model or service provider who's providing that model goes down? So that's the operational risk angle that we're seeing more of. The third angle, which I think it's very few companies doing today, is probably the strategic risk angle, right? Wherein being able to call out, if I'm using this particular, if there's an AI-driven attack, identity attack, right? That is reducing or impacting the reputation of my organization with my customers. What is my exposure in financial terms? Now, these are questions that boards would start to need to ask, because we are starting to ask those questions and get those questions from leaders in order to how are we able to measure those, in how do you quantify risk in financial terms and be able to convey that to the board as well, because that's what, at the end of the day, boards are concerned in being able to convey to the stakeholders and shareholders.
No, that's great, and those are some interesting lenses that you put to the whole conversation. So, sir, I'd like to bring you in now, from your vantage point. So, when we talk about India's DPI, we are implementing AI into systems which cater to healthcare, which cater to telecom, across the citizen supply chain, if you will. So, how do we make sure that the AI deployments that we're doing, and what capabilities do we have to make sure that these deployments are secure and they're taking care of the risks that the fellow panelists highlighted?
Yeah. Even now, we are really struggling with getting the cybersecurity maturity across all sectors. The financial sector, for example, is mature. But let's say take the health sector. It's not as mature as others. But if you look at the enthusiasm, for example, of the health sector to adopt AI, you will find that the level of enthusiasm is similar to what is there in the other sectors. So that is a big challenge. We've been engaging with the health sector, for example. We've had recent meetings also to say that how do I improve the cybersecurity posture of that sector. So that's a big challenge, actually, so we had this digital divide. We have a cybersecurity divide that's there. And now we are going to have this AI divide that's going to be there across enterprises in different sectors. So that is a challenge that is required to be addressed. There, I think, is the capacity building part. And also coming up with, frameworks where people have access to that framework and understand what is really required to be done. And, you talked of assessment. When an enterprise is coming with the AI system, is it secure? Is it doing the work it's supposed to do? So we don't have those assessment frameworks now. So if you're aware, the testing and assessment part is an important part, and creating that infrastructure so that people could go and then test and assess, that is important part. The DRDO has come up with an AI ETI framework, if you're aware of it. Similarly, from our office also, we funded a project, and it's around a year back. It started November of 2024. We funded the project for coming with an assessment framework for AI systems. So that one is the security aspect of that, and the other is, of course, the functional aspect. That also, in the sense that somebody claims that this AI system does something. So how do you actually assess that? So I think one is the capacity building part, and the other is the having the frameworks in place is good. One thing good about this country is that we have an institutional framework that's been established, especially because of cybersecurity over the period of time, like we have got the CERT India and CIPC, or their institutional frameworks. And also the sectoral regulators also come up with sandboxing regulations, in the sense that if you want to try out something new, you have these regulations that helps you to try out something new. So I think these, like in the financial sector, you have the RBI sandbox. In the telecom sector also, there's a mechanism. So I think people start using these sandboxes to prove technologies, to prove applications, to prove use cases. And that will help them to actually understand how it really works before they deploy in production. That, I think, would help going forward.
Awesome. Thank you, sir. And I think it's enlightening and enriching for all of us here to know your perspective, especially what the government is doing towards it. I'd like to bring in Lakshmi sir from Tata here for the next question.
Hello.
So,
please,
sir, if we reconvene
would
5 years from now,
all of you to take this conversation outside.
Here. What are we going to be talking about?
We really need to get the next session started.
What did we get right?
I think these discussions are very healthy, right? Whether AI with a positive lens or with a fear lens. I think we need to. On two comments. One is the question on assessment. We ourselves in Tadacom, when we asked ourselves the question, where do we want to be 5 years from now? And I made a statement that the next 5 years will determine the health of the company for the next 50 years. Right? Because the technologies are moving very fast. So for an assessment framework, we developed a framework ourselves. We studied a lot of material. We didn't find something good. So we developed an assessment framework where On one axis, we plotted the capability. It includes talent, it includes the platform, which is when I said, look, no point in doing individual use cases in an organization. How many use cases will you do? You need a platform approach, which is where we said AI operating system is required. So that is maturing. So on one axis, we are going to plot the capability, right? So it's talent, even culture. AI, I don't know whether people have appreciated this, is a very different paradigm. Right? Even now in the discussions, I see people talking about how AI can help automate things and do things faster. No, that's not what AI will do. AI, while the previous technologies of cloud and internet have helped companies to scale transactions, AI is going to scale decisions. And when you're scaling decisions, you need to think of a different paradigm altogether, right? And we are still talking in the old paradigm of what task can be automated and how it can be done. So this is a new paradigm. So in the capability axis, the culture dimensions would have to be thought through carefully, and talent appropriate. I find some of the younger talent are more easy to train on AI than some of the older, unfortunately. So I think the whole talent and capability equation is one axis, and we're going to plot ourselves. And the other axis is on the outcomes. What outcomes do you really want to deliver with AI? And there, outcomes could be more on efficiency. Outcomes could be more on the revenue enhancement. Outcomes could be more on the trust and the customer satisfaction. All those outcomes need to be plotted. I must admit, we ourselves are somewhere in the lower quadrant, and I hope we as a company will move to the top quadrant, and that needs to be defined, and that needs to be visualized, and only then you can move towards that. And that's what we are driving the company towards, and all the platform development that we're doing, strengthening our infrastructure for enterprises, and we've shared some of these assessments to our customers as well. So that is one. So I hope that most people would see themselves moving towards the top quadrant in 5 years' time. The second thing that I worried about in the context of strategy is, again, when people talk about AI and strategy, I believe that, like in the previous technology, when we had internet and cloud, there were new business models that came about. Right? So we had intermediaries coming, the booking.coms and others who disintermediated many people, or fintechs who came and did things better than the larger banks. And only when the larger entities woke up to the fact that these people are going to eat their lunch, and they have and that's what happened in the previous wave of technology. In the AI, I think similar disruption is waiting to happen. Don't know where and when and what, but if a strategy does not think about that as to what disruptions are going to happen, we would have missed the bus. So 5 years from now, I would expect a new class of companies who are AI native, who are out there going to disrupt the existing business model. So those are the two things I would expect in 5 years to happen.
Fabulous. And sir, one last question to you, Naren sir. If you were to give me a call 5 years from now and say, Samrat, this is how nation states have changed, what would that be?
See, one is, somewhere else also. AI and adoption of AI is a competitive advantage. Adoption of AI is, so that's why, you have to adopt AI. And so that's why, you have to adopt AI. Because there are other nations who don't adopt. There are other enterprises who don't adopt. There are other enterprises who look at